Commander Elias Ward never expected the end of the war to feel like this. The skies above Virel 9 were a sickly hue of burnt gold, stained with the fallout of ion blasts and decades of orbital bombardment. Beneath his boots, the ground was cracked and scorched, littered with the bones of machines and men both human and alien. The air stank of smoke, coolant, and blood. Somewhere in the distance, artillery still echoed like the dying breaths of a monster refusing to surrender. But it was over. The Allied front had won. The Zareth Empire had fallen. Elias should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt hollow. His command squad had been disbanded 3 weeks earlier. Most had gone home, what was left of home. Others had vanished into deep space, too haunted to return. Elias stayed behind, assigned to oversee the final surrender at Zareth Command Sector Theta. It was meant to be ceremonial. Symbolic. A gesture of control. What he got instead was a lesson in horror. The Zareth general, flanked by 2 towering guards in ceremonial armor, stood unmoved beneath the tattered remnants of their imperial banner. His skin was scaled and ridged, his eyes black and reflective like obsidian. He smiled, or at least mimicked it. "A gift," the general said, his voice translated through a rusted comm link. "For the human who bled more than most. Consider it a token of appreciation." Guards dragged something forward from the shadows of the bunker behind them. "No, someone." She stumbled into view, small, shackled at the wrists and ankles, a thick control collar pulsing dimly at her throat. Her skin shimmered a soft shade of blue beneath the dirt and bruises. Her hair, silver white and tangled, fell across her face like curtains drawn across a ruined temple. She didn't make a sound. Not when they yanked her to her knees. Not when one guard gripped her arm hard enough to draw blood. Not even when the general leaned down to her and whispered something Elias couldn't hear. Elias stared, his pulse hammering behind his eyes. He'd seen prisoners before. Too many. But this was different. The general turned back to him, gesturing grandly. "She is not Zareth. One of our projects. Bred for resilience. Conditioned for obedience. Her kind is no more, thanks to your efforts. So now she is yours." Elias felt the breath catch in his throat. "I don't want her," he said, flat and certain. The general laughed. "Then kill her. Makes no difference to me. But take her. It is tradition. You have earned her." His squad watched in silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The girl-woman, really, though she was impossibly young, didn't lift her head. But her fingers clenched around the chain. Just once. Just enough to tell Elias she was listening. He stepped forward. The general tilted his head, amused. "Curious. Will you play the benevolent master?" Elias knelt in front of her, careful not to make sudden moves. She flinched anyway. He saw her jaw tighten, the muscle twitch in her throat. Her breathing was steady, but too shallow. Controlled. Like someone used to pain. He reached for the collar. She stiffened. Elias paused. Then, deliberately, he unhooked his utility knife from his belt and spoke just loud enough for her to hear. "I don't know what they told you. But I'm not them." The blade hissed as it cut through the locking clasp. Sparks snapped against his gloves. The collar fell to the dirt with a thud. The silence that followed was heavier than the air before a storm. The woman didn't move. The general's smile faded. "Interesting," he murmured. "Let's see how long your mercy survives in a galaxy built on cruelty." Elias stood, pocketed the broken collar, and held out a hand. The woman looked at it. Her eyes were the color of winter steel, clear, bright, unreadable. She didn't take it. But she stood. Not because he told her to. Because she chose to. They walked away from the camp in silence. Past smoldering wreckage, past soldiers too exhausted to question what they'd witnessed. Past all the ghosts Elias had carried since the first shot was fired. And still, the only sound between them was the crunch of their boots on gravel. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't ask who he was. She only asked one question, quiet, sharp, and raw. Do I have a name? Elias stopped walking. Turned to look at her. No, he said gently. But you will. For the first time, her lips parted slightly. Not a smile. Not yet. But something that might have become one in another life. And in that moment, Elias understood, she wasn't his reward. She was a test. A reminder. A reckoning. Because war doesn't just destroy cities. It corrupts the souls of the people who survive it. The line between liberator and oppressor grows thinner with every compromise, every dehumanizing order, every time you look away from the chains on someone else's neck. And Elias Ward had seen enough chains to last a lifetime. He didn't know who she was. Didn't know where she came from. But he knew one thing with terrifying clarity. He wasn't going to let her disappear. Not into the system. Not into some forgotten spaceport. Not into the abyss of collateral damage. She wasn't his prisoner. She wasn't his responsibility. She was a person. And maybe, just maybe, in helping her become whole again, he might finally remember how to be human, too. Elias had never known silence like this. Not the silence of dead battlefields or empty bunkers, he was used to that. This silence was different. It lived in the narrow spaces between glances, in the quiet thrum of the ship's engine, in the unspoken things hanging between two people who didn't yet know how to exist in the same room. She didn't speak. Not after they left the surrender site. Not during the shuttle ride. Not when he showed her to the small cabin across from his own and told her it was hers now. She simply moved like a shadow, precise and quiet, hands folded tightly together like she was afraid to touch anything. Elias gave her space. Partly because it felt like the right thing to do. Mostly because he didn't know what else to offer her. He wasn't a healer. He wasn't good with broken things. He was a soldier trained to destroy, not to rebuild. And yet here he was, standing in his own ship, sharing oxygen with someone who had been treated like a possession for God knows how long. She didn't even flinch when the door closed behind her that first night. She just sat on the edge of the cot, her hands resting in her lap, her back perfectly straight. Not relaxed. Not comfortable. Just, waiting. Elias watched her on the monitor for less than a minute before the guilt hit him hard enough to make him turn it off. The next morning, he found the galley cleaned. Dishes washed. Storage crates organized by size and weight. Every loose wire in the hallway secured with startling precision. At first, he thought the ship's maintenance droid had glitched into overdrive. Then he saw her. On her knees beside an open panel in the navigation deck, a multi-tool in one hand, a bundle of exposed wires in the other. She was repairing a system he hadn't even realized was damaged. She looked up when she noticed him. Just looked. Didn't speak. Didn't explain. Elias crouched beside her and asked softly, "You used to work on ships?" She nodded once. He didn't press further. Just watched her hands steady, competent, unafraid. He realized then that she wasn't just trying to be useful. She was trying to have a reason to exist. Over the next few days, they settled into a strange rhythm. She never used the intercom. Never entered a room unless she was sure he wasn't there. But she worked. She fixed things no one else would have noticed. She learned the ship like it was a puzzle she'd been solving in her head for years. He started leaving tools out for her. Rations she might like. New clothes, not military issue, folded quietly on her cot. She never acknowledged the gestures, but she used them all. Still, she hadn't said a word. Until one night. Elias couldn't sleep. Dreams had clawed at his mind again, images of bodies stacked in smoke-filled trenches, screams that didn't belong to him but somehow lived in his bones. He wandered to the observation dome, hoping the stars might slow his thoughts down. And there she was. She stood barefoot, her back to him, framed by the vast swirl of a nebula outside the viewport. Her silver hair hung loose down her back. Her arms were folded across her chest, but her posture was softer now, less guarded, more contemplative. He didn't want to disturb her. But he also couldn't bring himself to leave. So he said the first thing that came to him, voice low, careful. You ever wonder what it's like to stand on one of those stars? She turned slightly. Just enough for him to see her profile in the dim light. They used to tell us, she said, her voice rough from disuse, that stars were gods. Watching. Judging. Elias stepped closer. Not too close. And what do you think? She was quiet for a long time. Then, I think stars don't care what we do. And I think I prefer it that way. He nodded, absorbing her words. They sounded like truth. Hard-earned, lived-in truth. I'm Elias, he said. I realized I never told you. I know, she replied, barely above a whisper. He smiled faintly. Do you have a name? Silence again. But not the kind that pushed him away. This one felt more like a pause, like the space before something important. Finally, she said, they called me Subject 47. That's not a name, Elias said gently. No. He waited. After a breath, she looked up at the stars and said, Lyra. That's what I wanted to be called. Once. He repeated it softly. Lyra. She looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time, he saw something flicker behind her eyes. Not fear. Not pain. Recognition. Not of him. Of herself. It was gone just as quickly. She looked back at the stars, her face once again unreadable. But something had shifted. Not much. Just a thread of tension loosening between them. A thread that might, given enough time, become a bridge. That night, Elias didn't go back to his cabin. He sat in the dome beside her, both of them staring at the endless dark. No more words were spoken. None were needed. It wasn't peace. Not yet. But it wasn't silence anymore, either. It was the beginning of something else. Something fragile. Something quietly alive. And as the ship drifted through the void, Elias found himself breathing easier for the first time in years. He wasn't alone anymore. And maybe, neither was she. The ship had begun to feel different. Not in any technical sense, its system still hummed with the same predictable rhythm, the life support still ticked with the same mechanical pulse. But to Elias, something beneath the surface had changed. The air felt less heavy. The silence less hollow. It wasn't peace, not exactly. But it was no longer the silence of two strangers trapped in a confined space. It was something slower, gentler, like the beginning of trust. Lyra never announced her presence. She never asked permission. But over time, Elias began to notice the subtle ways she was reshaping the world around her. It started with the tools. One morning, he found the main engine diagnostics kit reorganized, categorized not alphabetically, but by function, by urgency. Every wire bundled in color-coded coils, every tool sharpened, recalibrated, placed with intention. She hadn't said a word about it. But when he ran his next check, it took him half the time. He didn't comment. He just left a mug of heated synth tea on the workbench, then walked away. She drank it. The next day, the rations in the galley were sorted by expiration date. The lighting in the cargo bay adjusted to reduce power drain. A faulty stabilizer that had been throwing off the ship's lateral balance was repaired before Elias even realized it had become a problem. He asked her once, gently, how she'd known where the issue was. She didn't answer. Just blinked at him with that cool, unreadable gaze and returned to what she was doing. But Elias wasn't blind. He understood. She wasn't just fixing the ship. She was fixing herself. Not all at once. Not with declarations or drama. But piece by piece, in the small things, the things she could control. He saw it in the way she cleaned her hands after every task, scrubbing them raw until the scent of old grease and metal was replaced with something sterile, almost medicinal. He saw it in the way she began to move through the ship, not like a ghost, but like a person reclaiming space she'd once been told she didn't deserve. At first, Elias kept his distance. Not out of coldness, but respect. He didn't want to interrupt whatever this was becoming for her. But one night, as he passed the mess hall, he caught sight of her sitting alone at the small table, a bowl of untouched food in front of her. She wasn't staring off into space. She wasn't lost in thought. She was watching the control panels across the room with sharp, focused attention. Elias leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. Thinking of stealing my ship? She startled, just a twitch, then turned to face him. I don't know how to fly, she said, voice soft but steady. He arched a brow, walking slowly into the room. Good to know. Would have been awkward chasing you through hyperspace. There was a pause. Then barely perceptible, the corner of her mouth twitched upward. Not a smile. But close. Elias grabbed a drink from the dispenser and sat down across from her. He didn't speak right away. He'd learned that silence could be useful, if you let it breathe. She stared at him, wary but no longer distant. He nodded toward the bowl in front of her. Not hungry. I don't eat much, she said. He sipped his drink. Zareth rations'll do that to you. She didn't answer. But she picked up the spoon. Took a small bite. It wasn't much. But it was something. How long were you in their camps? He asked gently. Her fingers tightened slightly around the spoon. A long time. He didn't push. He just nodded. Before he could ask anything else, she looked up and said, "Why did you take me?" The question caught him off guard. Not because it was unexpected, but because she was finally ready to ask it out loud. Elias exhaled slowly, setting his cup down. He could have told her it was instinct. A gut reaction. A moment of anger toward the Zareth general. But none of that was the truth. Because I couldn't walk away from you, he said. Not again. She blinked. Again. He looked at her, steady and honest. I've seen too many people treated like you were. I've watched them break. And I've stood by, telling myself there was nothing I could do. But you looked like someone who hadn't broken yet. And I wasn't going to let them finish the job. She stared at him for a long time. Then, slowly, she nodded. She didn't say thank you. And he didn't expect her to. That night, the ship was quiet again. But it wasn't empty. Over the next week, something subtle began to change in Lyra. She started humming when she worked, barely audible, a sound so soft Elias almost thought he was imagining it. She stopped double-checking every room before entering. She began sitting in the cockpit during long flights, curled in the co-pilot's chair with a tablet in hand, studying navigation patterns like they were poetry. Elias began to realize something beautiful: she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was participating. One morning, he woke to the sound of tools clinking and found her elbow deep in the engine bay, hair tied up, sleeves rolled back. She didn't flinch when he entered. Didn't stop working. He crouched beside her. You always this much of a perfectionist? This ship is inefficient, she said without looking up. I'm fixing it. He grinned. You're doing a hell of a job. She hesitated. Then glanced at him, almost shyly. You said I could help. I did, he said. But I didn't expect you to do it better than me. She didn't smile. But her hands moved with more confidence. In that moment, Elias understood something he hadn't dared to admit. This ship had been a tomb for him, a relic of war, of duty, of everything he'd lost. Now, it felt like something else. It felt like the beginning of a home. And she was building it, piece by piece, with every bolt, every wire, every quiet act of purpose. And maybe, just maybe, she was building herself, too. Elias didn't remember hitting the floor. One moment he was running toward the docking ramp, Lyra close behind him, and the next heat. White hot. Blinding. A blast to his shoulder that ripped through muscle like fire and sent him sprawling against the bulkhead, breath punched from his lungs. He'd known the attack was coming. Or at least, suspected it. Too many whispers in the local channels. Too many former Zareth sympathizers sniffing around the outer systems. But suspicion wasn't the same as preparation, and now the docking bay was a war zone. Blaster fire tore through the air like lightning, cracking against metal crates and shattering fuel canisters. Smoke billowed. Alarms blared. Somewhere nearby, someone was shouting. And yet through it all he heard her voice. Elias? He blinked. Everything tilted. His arm wouldn't move. Pain pulsed through him in waves. But through the haze, he saw her face above him. Lyra. She was smaller than him, but when her arm slid under his, she moved with a strength that didn't come from muscle. It came from urgency. From choice. She didn't wait for permission. Didn't flinch when another blast hit the ground just behind them. She pulled him up, half carrying, half dragging him toward the ship's ramp. Just move, she whispered, not to him, but to herself. Just keep moving. Elias had seen many things in his time: soldiers break under pressure, civilians go numb from shock. He'd seen what desperation could do to good people. But he had never seen anyone look the way she did in that moment. Focused. Fierce. Unshaken. She didn't panic. She didn't freeze. She acted. And when they crossed the threshold into the ship and the blast doors slammed shut behind them, She was already pulling him toward the medical console. He tried to speak, but she silenced him with a look. "You're losing blood," she said, grabbing a cauterizing patch and tearing into his sleeve with surgical speed. He hissed through clenched teeth. "I've had worse." "You're not impressing me," she muttered. But her hands were shaking. Just a little. Just enough that he saw it. He caught her wrist. "Lyra dash. You were shot," she snapped, louder than she meant to. Then she froze, eyes wide, as if realizing she'd raised her voice for the first time in days. Maybe ever. He didn't let go. Just held her wrist gently, grounding her. "You saved me," he said, voice hoarse. She blinked, hard. "I couldn't leave you," she said, the words tumbling out fast. I thought if I let you go, I'd go back to being." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. He understood. It wasn't about the fight. It wasn't about survival. It was about what she'd become with him on this ship, in this strange, quiet life they were building. She had found herself in the spaces between systems, in the work of her hands, in the quiet nights under unfamiliar stars. And when she'd seen him fall, the fear hadn't been for her safety. It had been for what she might lose if he didn't get back up. Elias reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She was still breathing too fast. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. "You did good," he said. She laughed, soft and breathless, but bitter. "I was terrified." "You didn't look it?" "I was." "Then you chose anyway." She looked at him then. Truly looked. And something in her expression shifted like glass catching the sun, sharp and fragile all at once. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "Do what?" "This," she said, gesturing vaguely between them. "Feel something. Want something." Elias sat up straighter, ignoring the pull of pain in his shoulder. "You don't have to know. You just have to want to try." Silence fell between them again, but it wasn't cold. It wasn't avoidance. It was a pause filled with breath, with heartbeat, with the echo of unspoken choices. Lyra sat beside him slowly, her body taut, like she was still ready to run. But she didn't. She stayed. "I didn't think I could care about anyone again," she said. "I didn't think I deserved to." His voice was low. "That's not up to them. They built me to follow orders. To survive." "But you dash," she shook her head. "You looked at me like I was more." "You are," he said simply. Lyra reached out, hesitantly, her fingers brushing against his. Not clinging. Not seeking safety. Just contact. Real. Chosen. And for the first time since the day he freed her, Elias felt something solid settle in his chest. Not obligation. Not instinct. Connection. She could have run. She could have disappeared into the stars, into some distant system where no one would ask who she was or what she used to be. But she hadn't. She'd stayed. She'd fought. Not for herself. For him. For them. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. "I don't want to be your rescuer," he said. "You're not. I don't want to be your obligation. You're not that, either. Then what am I?" She looked down at their joined hands. Then back up at him. "You're the first person I've ever chosen." The words struck him harder than any blast ever had. Not because of their weight but because of their simplicity. Not love. Not yet. But choice. That was more sacred. More honest. Lyra leaned in, forehead resting gently against his. A shared breath. A quiet promise. She didn't kiss him. Not then. But she didn't need to. The moment was enough. She'd made her decision. And Elias, bruised and bleeding, found himself smiling not from relief, but from the quiet certainty that something had changed. He wasn't carrying her anymore. They were walking forward together. And wherever that path led, it would be on her terms. Not as a prisoner. Not as a weapon. But as a woman who had found her voice and chosen, freely, to use it. There was no ceremony. No music. No witnesses. The air outside the ship was too thin to carry sound anyway, and the stars didn't clap for love stories, no matter how hard-earned. But that never mattered to Elias or Lyra. What they stood in that moment to create had nothing to do with spectacle. It was never going to be a fairy tale. It was something better. The platform where they stood was part of an abandoned refueling station, orbiting a long dead moon. The only light came from the distant glint of a sun neither of them knew the name of, and the warm glow from the interior of the ship behind them. Elias had made sure the hull platform was secure, gravity field steady, and the silence blessedly uninterrupted. Lyra stepped out first. She wasn't wearing anything extravagant. Just a utility jumpsuit with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair loosely braided over one shoulder. There was still a faint scar at the base of her neck where the collar used to be. She never hid it. Not anymore. Elias followed, a small object in his hand. 2 rings simple, forged from scrap metal they'd salvaged together on some nameless world 6 systems back. The bands weren't symmetrical. One was slightly thicker than the other. She'd made his. He'd made hers. Neither of them said it, but both knew the imperfections were what made them real. They didn't stand face to face immediately. Instead, they walked the perimeter of the platform slowly, side by side, saying nothing. Letting the moment settle into them like warmth after too many years of cold. When Lyra finally turned to look at him, there was a quiet stillness in her eyes. "I never thought I'd do this," she said. "Not because I didn't want to. But because I didn't think I was allowed to." Elias didn't speak. He knew what she meant. She'd been created to obey, conditioned to survive, shaped by hands that never asked what she wanted. Even freedom had come as a surprise, like waking up and finding the door unlocked after a lifetime in chains. This wasn't about love in the traditional sense. It wasn't about passion or vows. It was about permission, her permission to be seen, to be chosen, and most of all, to choose. Elias held out her ring. "You don't belong to me," he said quietly. "You never have." She took the ring and slid it onto her finger, eyes never leaving his. "But I belong with you," she said. Then she held out his. He didn't hesitate. It wasn't a promise made with fanfare or fireworks. It was a quiet agreement between 2 people who had already walked through fire and still decided to reach for each other on the other side. Lyra stepped closer. "This doesn't make us safe," she said. "The galaxy's still broken." "I know," Elias replied. "But so are we." There was a pause, then a soft, knowing smile tugged at her lips. "Not as much as we used to be." He chuckled. "I'll take that." She leaned into him, head against his shoulder. He rested his chin on her hair. The world outside them remained the same, unforgiving, chaotic, unpredictable. But here, on this rusted piece of metal floating through nowhere, something extraordinary had happened. They had created peace. Not the kind won in battles. Not the kind written into treaties. But the kind built slowly, by hand and heart, in stolen moments of rest and effort. In every wire she repaired. In every wound he stitched. In every meal shared, every silence honored, every wall taken down piece by piece. Later that night, they sat in the cockpit of the ship, watching the stars stretch across the void. Lyra curled up in the co-pilot's chair like she belonged there, which, of course, she did. Elias watched her out of the corner of his eye. Her face was relaxed. There was a softness to her now that hadn't existed before. Not weakness. Never that. Just ease. She glanced at him. "You think it's okay that we didn't do anything official?" she asked. He raised an eyebrow. "You mean the fact that we didn't broadcast a registry to the entire quadrant? I think we'll survive." She smirked. "It's not about the announcement." "I know." He turned his chair slightly, facing her. "We don't need a title. We have what matters. Which is, I wake up and you're here," he said. "That's enough." Her eyes softened. For so long, Lyra had measured her worth by what she could do, how useful she could be, how silent she could stay, how perfectly she could blend into the life someone else built for her. But now, in this quiet corner of space, with Elias beside her and no one watching, she realized something she hadn't allowed herself to feel. She belonged. Not because someone claimed her, but because she had claimed herself. And in doing so, she found something entirely unexpected. Love not as a reward, not as a rescue, but as a choice made freely, without condition, without fear. A choice that didn't erase her past, but wove it into something stronger. Lyra reached across the console and took Elias's hand. "We'll keep moving," she said. "We always do," he replied. "But maybe not to run this time." He met her gaze. "No. This time, we go where we want." She nodded. It was a small thing. But for two people who had once only known obedience and violence, small things were everything. And as the ship shifted into jump space, the stars blurring into lines of light, they sat together, tethered not by duty or survival, but by something far more rare. Understanding. It wasn't a perfect life. But it was theirs. And that made all the difference. The first ping seemed ordinary. Just another passing signal on the outer fringe, a ghost frequency from a derelict outpost, or a routine systems update. Elias almost dismissed it, fingers hovering over the comms console. But something about the way the frequency lingered, the way it waited, felt wrong. Lyra entered the cockpit just as he patched it through. She froze mid-step when the screen flickered to life, casting a pale blue glow across the cabin. The face that appeared was Zareth. Older. Slower. But unmistakable. Its eyes were dark, lidless, and calm in a way that made Elias's chest tighten. This wasn't a threat or a bluff. This was something worse: certainty. Designation, Subject 47, the voice croaked, metallic and smooth, as if it had been practicing human cadence. Genetic markers confirmed. Neural sync intact. Project Bloodroot has not failed after all. Elias reached for the kill switch, but Lyra stepped forward. Her voice was low, almost breathless. "Don't." The Zareth creature inclined its head slightly. "How fascinating. You've bonded with your handler. Perhaps we underestimated your capacity for mimicry." Lyra's breath caught. The words sliced through the quiet with surgical precision. "You were not made to serve," it continued. You were made to replace us. A hybrid meant to outlive our extinction. And now, you've gone feral. The transmission ended. Silence returned, but it was no longer gentle. Lyra backed away from the console as if it had bitten her. Her shoulders shook once, then stilled, like she'd locked every joint in place to avoid crumbling. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just stood there, arms wrapped tightly around herself, eyes distant. Lyra, Elias said softly. She didn't respond. I didn't know. She turned sharply. But it makes sense, doesn't it? Her voice cracked not from rage, but from something deeper. Something far more dangerous. They never captured me. I wasn't a victim of war. I was the war. The final experiment. A creation designed to be more obedient, more adaptable, more human. Elias stepped closer, but she moved away, shaking her head. Every time I thought I was reclaiming something, my voice, my will, it wasn't mine to begin with. It was theirs. Maybe everything I've felt, everything I've said to you, maybe none of it was real. Stop, Elias said, firmer now. That's not who you are. She laughed, hollow and aching. Who am I then, Elias? Tell me. What do you call someone built in a lab, taught to simulate personhood, handed off like a broken tool of war? You're not a weapon. You're wrong. I was just too naive to see it. He crossed the space between them, gently but without hesitation. You said it yourself, Lyra. You chose me. That choice could have been programmed. And this, he asked, lifting her hand in his, placing it over his chest. The way you fought to protect me? The way you stayed when you could have disappeared into the stars? Was that programming? Her eyes flicked up to meet his, and for a moment, everything inside her seemed to fracture under the weight of the question. I don't know, she whispered. I do, Elias said. Because I've seen what programming looks like. It doesn't hesitate. It doesn't doubt. It doesn't love. She didn't flinch at the word, but she didn't accept it either. Not yet. He stepped back slightly, giving her space. I won't tell you who you are, Lyra. That's yours to decide. But I know what you are not theirs. Her silence stretched into something brittle. Then she said, almost to herself, I want to believe you. Elias nodded. Then let's find out together. She looked down at her hand still resting over his heart and slowly pulled it away. Not in rejection. In recognition. Her voice was steadier now. If they're still out there, if they're hunting people like me. Elias answered before she finished. Then we stop running. We fight. On our terms. Lyra closed her eyes. When she opened them, something had shifted. Not clarity. But conviction. I'm with you, she said. Whatever comes next. I'm with you. And for the first time in her life, she knew it wasn't because someone had chosen her. It was because she had chosen herself. The stars had stopped looking like destinations a long time ago. For Elias, they used to be a map, coordinates to reach, systems to conquer, outposts to defend. But now, in the quiet hours between missions and memories, they were something else entirely. Not promises. Not threats. Just light. Constant. Distant. Unbothered. He sat in the pilot's chair of the Halcyon Drift, his hands resting lightly on the controls though the ship flew steady. The hum of the engine had become a lullaby, familiar and comforting, like the beat of a heart that refused to stop even after everything else had. Behind him, soft footsteps echoed across the deck. Lyra entered the cockpit without a word, a daytop hat in one hand, her silver hair tied back loosely the way she always wore it when she was focused. She moved with ease now, not cautiously, not like a guest but with ownership. Like this place, this ship, this life, belonged to her just as much as it did to him. She dropped into the co-pilot's seat and propped one leg under herself. Her fingers flew over the diagnostic console, scanning for fluctuations in the shield matrix. She didn't even glance at the numbers anymore. She knew the ship by feel. Elias watched her in silence for a moment. Even now, he found himself marveling at the shift. Not the obvious things, her words, her movements, but the subtle ones. The way she breathed deeper. The way she leaned back in her chair instead of sitting like she was bracing for pain. The way she left small things undone, plates in the sink, a book half open because she had stopped expecting to be moved or punished or taken. This was what healing looked like. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. It didn't arrive in some brilliant moment of epiphany. It was quieter than that. Slower. And so much more real. They were still fugitives in a galaxy too slow to change. Still hunted by remnants of the past, Zareth loyalists, mercenaries, shadow governments afraid of what Lyra represented. But none of that mattered the way it used to. Because she was no longer running from who she had been. And Elias no longer carried the guilt of who he had failed to be. They had each other now. That changed everything. A light flashed on the comm screen, an incoming transmission. Elias leaned forward, expecting another trader or distress call. Instead, the ID tag hit him like a ghost walking through the room. Colonial Fleet. High Command. He hesitated. Lyra noticed immediately. "You're not answering," she said, setting her daytop hat down. "It's from someone I used to know," he murmured. "Military. Used to be my superior. Captain Ren Hale." Lyra turned in her seat to face him, reading the tension in his jaw. "What do they want?" "I don't know yet. But deep down, he did. You didn't reach out to a man like Elias Ward unless something was coming. Something big. Something dangerous. Something that required people who could live in the gray spaces, outside of command structures, outside of rules. People like him. He could walk away. Ignore it. Shut the screen and fly to a system no one cared about. A quiet moon. A nameless sky. But then he looked at Lyra. And he remembered. He hadn't saved her. She had saved herself. But he had given her the space to do it. The choice. And now there were others out there like her, still in chains, still waiting for someone to not turn away. Lyra must have seen the decision forming in his eyes. "You're thinking about going," she said. No judgment. No fear. Just observation. Elias nodded. "I can't pretend I don't care," he said. "No," she agreed. "You never could." He exhaled, then reached for the COMM. Before he hit accept, he looked at her. "You don't have to come with me." She tilted her head, amused. "You really think I'm letting you get shot again without backup?" He smiled, soft and genuine. "You sure?" "I wasn't built to run anymore," she said. "And you're not built to quit." He pressed the button. The screen flickered to life, revealing Captain Hale's face, older, wearier, but still sharp-eyed. She didn't waste time with greetings. "Grayson," she said. There's something moving out in the fringe systems. A remnant of Zareth biotech. We're losing people, scientists, civilians. We think it's targeting anyone connected to the experiments. Elias felt Lyra go still beside him. Hale's voice softened. I know who's sitting next to you. We need you both. The screen cut to black. Elias leaned back, the weight of it all sitting heavy but not unbearable. Lyra looked ahead, hands clasped in her lap. You want to do this? He asked. She thought for a moment. Then, very slowly, she nodded. I'm not who I was, she said. But what they made me into, maybe I can use that now. For something better. He took her hand, their fingers interlocking with ease. Where to, co-pilot? She glanced at him, her expression unreadable then softened. Wherever we're needed. The stars outside shimmered as the ship turned toward the outer systems. And for the first time in years, Elias didn't feel like he was leaving anything behind. Not duty. Not grief. Not even home. Because home wasn't a place. It was the hand in his, the silence between words, the presence beside him that no longer feared being seen. Everywhere they went, as long as she was there. Everywhere was home.